Cooperate with the inevitable. When I was a little boy, I was playing with some of my friends in the attic of an old, abandoned log house in northwest Missouri. As I climbed down out of the attic, I rested my feet on a windowsill for a moment and then jumped. I had a ring on my left forefinger, and as I jumped, the ring caught on a nailhead and tore off my finger. I screamed. I was terrified. I was positive I was going to die. But after the hand healed, I never worried about it for one split second. What would have been the use? I accepted the inevitable.
Now I often go for a month at a time without even thinking about the fact that I have only 3 fingers and a thumb on my left hand. A few years ago, I met a man who was running a freight elevator in one of the downtown office buildings in New York. I noticed that his left hand had been cut off at the wrist. I asked him if the loss of that hand bothered him. He said, "Oh, no, I hardly ever think about it. I am not married, and the only time I ever think about it is when I try to thread a needle." It is astonishing how quickly we can accept almost any situation if we have to adjust ourselves to it and forget about it.
I often think of an inscription on the ruins of a 15th century cathedral in Amsterdam, Holland. This inscription says in Flemish, "It is so. It cannot be otherwise." As you and I march across the decades of time, we are going to meet a lot of unpleasant situations that are so. They cannot be otherwise. We have our choice. We can either accept them as inevitable and adjust ourselves to them, or we can ruin our lives with rebellion and maybe end up with a nervous breakdown. Here is a bit of sage advice from one of my favorite philosophers, William James. "Be willing to have it so," he said. Acceptance of what has happened is the first step to overcoming the consequence of any misfortune. Elizabeth Conley, of 2840 Northeast 49th Avenue, Portland, Oregon, had to find that out the hard way. Here is a letter that she wrote me recently. On the very day that America was celebrating the victory of our armed forces in North Africa, the letter says, "I received a telegram from the War Department. My nephew, the person I loved most, was missing in action." A short time later, another telegram arrived saying he was dead.
I was prostrate with grief. Up to that time, I had felt that life had been very good to me. I had a job I loved. I had helped to raise this nephew. He represented to me all that was fine and good in young manhood. I had felt that all the bread I had cast upon the waters was coming back to me as cake. Then came this telegram. My whole world collapsed. I felt there was nothing left to live for. I neglected my work, neglected my friends. I let everything go. I was bitter and resentful. Why did my loving nephew have to be taken? Why did this good boy with life all before him, why did he have to be killed? I couldn't accept it. My grief was so overwhelming that I decided to give up my work, and go away and hide myself in my tears and bitterness.
I was clearing out my desk, getting ready to quit, when I came across a letter that I had forgotten, a letter from this nephew who had been killed, a letter he had written to me when my mother had died a few years ago. "Of course, we will miss her," the letter said, "and especially you. But I know you'll carry on. Your own personal philosophy will make you do that. I shall never forget the beautiful truths you taught me. Wherever I am, or how far apart we may be, I shall always remember that you taught me to smile, and to take whatever comes, like a man." I read and reread that letter. It seemed as if he were there beside me, speaking to me. He seemed to be saying to me, "Why don't you do what you taught me to do? Carry on, no matter what happens. Hide your private sorrows under a smile and carry on."
So, I went back to my work. I stopped being bitter and rebellious. I kept saying to myself, "It is done. I can't change it. But I can and will carry on as he wished me to do." I threw all my mind and strength into my work. I wrote letters to soldiers, to other people's boys. I joined an adult education class at night, seeking out new interests and making new friends. I can hardly believe the change that has come over me. I have ceased mourning over the past that is forever gone. I am living each day now with joy, just as my nephew would have wanted me to do. I have made peace with life. I have accepted my fate. I am now living a fuller and more complete life than I had ever known.
Elizabeth Conley, out in Portland, Oregon, learned what all of us will have to learn sooner or later, namely, that we must accept and cooperate with the inevitable. It is so. It cannot be otherwise. That is not an easy lesson to learn. Even kings on their thrones have to keep reminding themselves of it. The late George V had these framed words hanging on the wall of his library in Buckingham Palace: "Teach me neither to cry for the moon nor over spilt milk." The same thought is expressed by Schopenhauer in this way: a good supply of resignation is of the first importance in providing for the journey of life. Obviously, circumstances alone do not make us happy or unhappy. It is the way we react to circumstances that determines our feelings. Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is within you. That is where the kingdom of hell is, too.
We can all endure disaster and tragedy and triumph over them if we have to. We may not think we can, but we have surprisingly strong inner resources that will see us through if we will only make use of them. We are stronger than we think. The late Booth Tarkington always said, "I could take anything that life could force upon me except one thing, blindness. I could never endure that." Then one day, when he was along in his 60s, Tarkington glanced down at the carpet on the floor. The colors were blurred. He couldn't see the pattern. He went to a specialist. He learned the tragic truth: he was losing his sight. One eye was nearly blind, the other would follow. That which he feared most had come upon him.
And how did Tarkington react to this worst of all disasters? Did he feel, "This is it. This is the end of my life"? No, to his amazement, he felt quite gay. He even called upon his humor. Floating specks annoyed him; they would swim across his eyes and cut off his vision. Yet when the largest of these specks would swim across his sight, he would say, "Hello. There's grandfather again. Wonder where he's going on this fine morning." How could fate ever conquer a spirit like that? The answer is it couldn't. When total blindness closed in, Tarkington said, "I found I could take the loss of my eyesight, just as a man can take anything else. If I lost all 5 of my senses, I know I could live on inside my mind. For it is in the mind we see, and in the mind we live, whether we know it or not."
In the hope of restoring his eyesight, Tarkington had to go through more than 12 operations within 1 year. With local anesthetic. Did he rail against this? He knew it had to be done. He knew he couldn't escape it, so the only way to lessen his suffering was to take it with grace. He refused a private room at the hospital and went into a ward, where he could be with other people who had troubles, too. He tried to cheer them up. And when he had to submit to repeated operations fully conscious of what was being done to his eyes, he tried to remember how fortunate he was. "How wonderful," he said. "How wonderful that science now has the skill to operate on anything so delicate as the human eye."
The average man would have been a nervous wreck if he had had to endure more than 12 operations and blindness. Yet Tarkington said, "I would not exchange this experience for a happier one." It taught him acceptance. It taught him that nothing life could bring him was beyond his strength to endure. It taught him, as John Milton discovered, that it is not miserable to be blind, it is only miserable not to be able to endure blindness. Margaret Fuller, the famous New England feminist, once offered as her credo, "I accept the universe." When grouchy old Thomas Carlyle heard that in England, he snorted, "By gad, she'd better." Yes, and by gad, you and I had better accept the inevitable, too.
If we rail and kick against it and grow bitter, we won't change the inevitable, but we will change ourselves. Oh no. I have tried it. I once refused to accept an inevitable situation with which I was confronted. I played the fool and railed against it, and rebelled. I turned my nights into hells of insomnia. I brought upon myself everything I didn't want. Finally, after a year of self-torture, I had to accept what I knew from the outset I couldn't possibly alter. I should have cried out years ago with old Walt Whitman, "Oh, to confront night, storms, hunger, ridicule, accident, rebuffs as the trees and animals do."
I spent 12 years working with cattle, yet I never saw a Jersey cow running a temperature because the pasture was burning up from a lack of rain or because of sleet and cold or because her boyfriend was paying too much attention to another heifer. The animals confront night, storms, and hunger calmly, so they never have nervous breakdowns or stomach ulcers, and they never go insane. Am I advocating that we simply bow down to all the adversities that come our way? Not by a long shot. That is mere fatalism. As long as there is a chance that we can save a situation, let's fight. But when common sense tells us that